Thank you. First, thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm very glad to share work in progress for my book project, Gender Order of Asylum. That's the working title. And this project takes a global perspective on how gender, sexuality, and violence are mobilized in assessing and tailoring protection across different governance contexts. It builds on multi-sited qualitative research, examining how vulnerability is defined, operationalized, and translated institutionally. In the circulate abstract, I framed this comparatively, referring to research across Germany and the UK. Today, however, I would like to sharpen the focus slightly, and rather than comparing systems, I zoom in on one structural transformation that cuts across them: the infrastructuralization of vulnerability. To make that transformation analytically visible, I focus on Germany, which is always entangled within the EU level developments and European agency operational tools. Over the past decade, vulnerability has shifted from an ethical concern to a structuring principle of asylum governance. It no longer appeals only as descriptive category. It increasingly organizes procedures, classifications, and forms of recognition. And this leads me to my central question of today that I would like to cover in this talk, and it is: what happens when vulnerability becomes the primary frame from which asylum governance operates? What does that shift to recognition, to institutional authority, and to legibility of suffering? So let me start with the shift. In earlier work, by noticing on a scholarly work that I outlined here in the presentation, I began noticing that gender and sexual orientation sensitive approaches developed through decades of feminist struggles were increasingly reframed under administrative label of special protection needs. What had emerged as a politics of recognition was being translated into procedural category. In feminist theory, vulnerability is rational and universal. It describes shared exposure, interdependence, and ethical responsibility. It is not a fixed attribute to a particular groups. Yet in contemporary asylum systems, vulnerability is no longer presumed as a shared condition. It must be identified, classified, documented, verified. And this is not merely a semantic change. It's a single structural shift. Vulnerability moves from ethical vocabulary to an administratively assessed condition. And at EU level, for those who follow a bit of changes in the asylum policies, the newest Pact on Migration of 2024 that will come in power very shortly in June, articulates care, and I quote, for most vulnerable, alongside stricter screening, biometric registration, and interoperable data infrastructures, explicitly balancing protection with concerns about the abuse of the system. In Germany, this resonates with the move from the moment of Angela Merkel's Wir schaffen das, we will do this, toward the highly proceduralized system structured around acceleration, credibility assessment, and systematic identification of what is in Germany called besondere Schutzbedürftigkeit, and I will talk about it later, but translates as special needs. Vulnerability, therefore, does not simply enable protection. It operates within a securitized governance architecture that differentiates between the deserving and the suspect. And recognition no longer precedes procedure, it becomes the outcome of assessment. So the question becomes, How does vulnerability shift from shared exposure to selective recognition? And what does that shift do institutionally? So to give you a bit of roadmap and methodologically position myself, to understand this shift, I trace vulnerability across three interconnected governance levels: the EU legal framework, the asylum agency operationalization, and German procedural implementation, like a member state. This allows me to follow what I call the vertical circulation of vulnerability, how concept travels, stabilizes, and changes form. Methodologically, I drawn feminist critical discourse analysis, specifically the discourse-historical approach. And what interests me most here is recontextualization, how meanings shift when they move from law to tools, from tools to procedures, from procedures to files. So this is not only about language, it is about how discourse becomes an institutional architecture. I focused on 4 discursive strategies: nomination, so how subjects are named, for instance, categories such as unaccompanied minor, LGBTIQ applicant, and others, stabilize who can appear as vulnerable. Then predication, what attributes are attached. Individuals become traumatized, dependent, at risk. These are like attributes that are linked to these categories. Then argumentations, how measures are justified. In this context, this is then expanded screening and biometric registrations that are then framed as necessary to protect the most vulnerable. And finally, recontextualization. Here we can see how discourse travels. Legal definitions become indicators, experience is then documentation, and narrative becomes an institutional input. And this is where vulnerability shifts from moral vocabulary to operational logic. Let me briefly say a couple of words of this multi-level governance of vulnerability, because Germany, or as a member state, does not operate in isolation. It is embedded in a multi-level European structure. The EU legislates, then the EUI, which is European Agency for Asylum, translates law into operational formats. And then member states, Germany in this context, implements and stabilize categories procedurally. At each stage, vulnerability becomes more structured and, crucially, more administratively actionable. And in this context, what begins as a legal language becomes tool logic that eventually links to decisionable status. So a few words about legal framing of vulnerability. At the EU level, vulnerability is codified through the Reception Condition Directive and then reinforced in a pact, the new Asylum Pact on Migration 2024. So I'm not a legal scholar, I'm a sociologist, so we can talk about this legislation more into details later. Then the new screening regulation established mandatory pre-entry procedures. These are procedures such as identifications, health checks, fingerprinting, then Eurodac registration. In the newest pact, Eurodac now includes expanded biometrical data, including facial images. But what matters here analytically is not that vulnerability exists as a category. It is more about this where it is embedded. It is situated inside screening and biometrical infrastructures. At the same time, political discourse stresses the need to balance protection with preventing abuse of the system. Here, and suspicion in this context are articulated together, and vulnerability becomes part of governance architecture that simultaneously protects, but it also filters. It filters, but I want to share you a couple of images, not a couple of images, to share a text from the EU guidance, because and to show a bit more tangibly how vulnerability vulnerability or discuss vulnerability before the tool. So in EU guidance, vulnerability still appears relational. The example that you can read is telling. A girl unable to speak openly before a male guard, a torture survivor unable to narrate trauma, a person with hearing impairment missing procedural cues. Here, vulnerability is situational and interactional. We can probably say also intersectional, shaped by gender dynamics. It depends on context, and it is not yet quantified. So the key question becomes, what happens when this relational understanding enters a digital assessment tool? So the European Agency for Asylum translates legal definitions into digital assessment interface. The IPCN and SVNA, or the Tool for Identification of Persons with Special Needs and Special Needs Vulnerability Assessment, they structure identification through predefined indicators that you can see here in the slide, and vulnerability becomes selectable. But also notice the visual coding from the screenshot, visual coding from the screenshot from the EU website. We have here a female coded silhouette holding a child. The interface anticipates a recognizable figure of vulnerability, maternal, dependent, accompanied, and this is not neutral. By aligning vulnerability with feminized imaginary, the tool simultaneously renders certain masculinities, particularly single racialized men. They become less readily legible as vulnerable. So the interface does not merely record vulnerability, it frames perception before assessment begins. And this is recontextualization not only of law, but of gendered imaginaries into interface design. The interface structures perception, it defines, and I here also copied two screenshots for you from the interface of the same tool. It structures perception, it defines what can count as vulnerability, how it must be identified, and also where intervention is triggered. This is nomination through categorization. Predication occurs through indicator attributes, as this visual ad, as you can see. For example, structure drop down the list, privilege visible bodily signs of harm, as you can see on the right side. Vulnerability becomes here modular, selectable, composable. And this is not merely a representation, it is an infrastructural inscription. As it reads here, and I highlighted for you, the person normally female. This further gender descript and accommodate images. I brought here further material to just briefly illustrate how the illustrate this gendering or feminizing of the script of vulnerability. One is from the EU training guidelines for the caseworkers who use interface, and the second one is from the video that is also used for training. But mindful of time, I would now like to bring you to the German case. So here vulnerability is inserted into an already data-heavy procedural architecture or system. It begins with registration, that is then personal data collection, fingerprinting, and centralized storage in a federal system of registry that is actually in Nuremberg. From a discourse historical perspective, this sequencing matters. Recognizability does not begin with vulnerability. It begins with administrative inscription. That means that before someone can be recognized as a vulnerable person or having special needs, or they must first become a registered biometric case file. Vulnerability is processed inside the system. It does not precede it. Vulnerability is then institutionalized through the category that I mentioned before, besondere Schutzbedürftigkeit, or special needs. The system requires decisionable status. As the material from Berlin network says, either you are recognized as particularly vulnerable or not recognized. And this binary captures the procedural logic. And the Berlin network that I just mentioned, and you see here the diagram of how the assessment in this state is organized, provides structural and geostate coordination. But nationwide, there is no uniform identification procedure, not yet. At the same time, federal government deploys specialized decision makers, the so-called Sonderbeauftragte, trained for cases involving gender-based violence, unaccompanied minors, or trafficking and torture survivors. So recognition is not only categorized, it is also professionalized. Yet the tension remains, as I have been reading in the material from the Berlin network. Protection needs are described as situational and context dependent, but the procedure itself requires stabilization, relational vulnerability versus decisionable administrative status. In discourse analysis terms, nomination fixes the subject into a category, and predications attaches attributes, such as traumatized, dependent, at risk. And vulnerability becomes stabilized as a status that can circulate. So what appears as recognition is in practice a dense infrastructure of identification, as you can see this on this diagram. Or you could see concepts, revisions, forms increasingly standardize how vulnerability must be recorded. There are a number of screening tools designed for that to translate experience into measurable indicators. Medical documentation may translate harm or is translating harm into specific diagnostic codes, such as ICD-10, that describes if person has certain visible harms or is possibly survivor of torture or victim of torture. And here something analytically important happens. Potential vulnerability can trigger procedural guarantees even before formal recognition. So vulnerability therefore operates as a threshold category. It can reorganize the procedure while remaining provisional. But consider here the translation process itself. Narrative becomes an indicator, a screening score, a diagnostic code, a certificate, a circulating file. In some cases, this culminates in a formal certificate of special protection needs, the so-called Bescheinigung besondere Schutzbedürftigkeit, or certificate of special protection needs. These certificates stabilize vulnerability as administrative fact, and it enables circulation across institutions. It can affect, or it affects, accommodation, type of accommodation you are entitled, also timelines, if your case will be processed quicker, but also procedural safeguards. And here recontextualization becomes concrete. Biography becomes legible only through institutional language or specific genre of institutional language. An experience must align with form. And once formatted, once certified, vulnerability further circulates. And in this circulation, it is this circulation that produces administrative power. In the interviews with the frontline workers, I have learned actually about difficulty of translating, and they all in detail describe this, difficulty of translating complex relational experiences into predefined forms and formats. They know vulnerability is situational and evolving, but the system requires stabilization. So what they do, they mediate between lived experience and administrative status. But also at the same time, their work sustains the infrastructure while also revealing its limits. So if we step back, we can see a clear pattern emerging. At the EU level, vulnerability is codified as a legal category within screening and border governance. At the European Agency for Asylum level, it is translated into operational logic. We have indicators, checklists, we have digital tools like IPCN and SVNA. At the German level, it stabilizes as documented administrative status, identified, certified, circulated. The same concept travels, but it changes form. It moves from moral vocabulary to legal category, to technical interface, to administrative flow. With each translation, ambiguity narrows and administrative actionability increases. And in this context, digitalization does not invent vulnerability governance. It is something that stabilizes, it scales it, and it embeds it in infrastructure. And once embedded, vulnerability becomes a structuring logic of recognition. And this we can see like very much clearly in the way how the new pact is like evolving and what it requires, because the new pact has something called crisis regulation, and it makes this architecture explicit because it allows derogations from procedural guarantees. So the system is designed to stretch, and then protection becomes conditional and adjustable to emergency logics. In this context, then, care and control are not opposites. They are rather structurally intertwined, and even vulnerability governance operates within a framework capable of acceleration, but also suspension. I would like now to return to my initial question and ask what happens when vulnerability becomes the primary frame of asylum governance. We see structural transformation. Vulnerability moves from ethical relation to administrative classification to digitally operationalized variable. It becomes actionable only when it fits institutional templates. It must align with categories, match indicators, circulate through documentation, travel across databases. But once infrastructural vulnerability shapes, it shapes what counts as a harm, what counts as need, what counts and who counts as deserving. This is not simply the expansion of humanitarian concern. It is a redistribution of authority over recognition. And what I would say the crucial question is therefore, and I would like to finish with this question, who defines vulnerability through which discursive and technical formats? And what happens to those who do not fit the script? If vulnerability becomes a digital grammar of recognition, then asylum governance structures the conditions under which suffering becomes administratively speakable. Thank you very much for your attention, and I very much look forward to your questions.